Hey, I guess I'm here because I could use some advice, or at least a place to get this off my chest. My name's Henry, and I've been married to Mia for 5 years now. We met at this art gallery opening in Brooklyn, an exhibition about urban landscapes. I remember the night clearly because it felt like fate. I was there with some friends, and she walked in with this group of artists. She looked so at home, so in her element, surrounded by these abstract pieces on the wall. Mia was magnetic. She had this energy, and when we got to talking, it was like we'd known each other for years. I'm an architect, the kind that's really into urban sustainability and making cities a little less overwhelming. Photography's my other thing. I take my camera with me everywhere, trying to capture how people fit into these spaces we build. Mia, on the other hand, is all about contemporary art. She curates exhibitions, analyzes trends, and promotes young artists. She was passionate and smart, and I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. We understood each other's work even though it was so different. Her world was color and creativity. Mine was structure and function. We balanced each other out. For the longest time, our relationship felt perfect. We'd have these deep, late-night talks about life and art, our dreams, and how we'd change the world in our own little ways. She loved my passion for architecture, and I admired her dedication to art. We traveled, went to exhibitions, and made memories that felt solid, unbreakable. Or at least, that's what I thought. Because recently, it feels like something has shifted. It started small. Mia became distant. At first, I chalked it up to stress from a new exhibition she was working on. She'd been staying at the gallery later than usual, sometimes coming home after midnight, and she seemed exhausted. But then, she started making excuses to skip the little things we used to do together. Our weekend coffee rituals, lazy Saturday morning walks. She was glued to her phone, always typing away. And when I'd ask about it, she brushed me off with a quick, "Oh, it's work stuff," or "just a friend." Maybe I'm overthinking, I tell myself. But then again, there was something different. Like her energy had shifted. She was cold, and sometimes when I looked at her, it felt like she was looking right past me. And the lies, they were small at first. She'd say she was at work, but her friend Claire would post a picture of them at some bar across town. When I asked, she'd just laugh it off, saying, "I can't even grab a drink with a friend without you getting suspicious." It was weird, though. Mia wasn't someone who used to hide things. For the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. So, after those first little hints, things just kept getting weirder. There were more late nights and random work trips that didn't seem to make sense. I'd text her, and hours would go by before I'd get a reply. And when she did respond, it was always short, vague answers. It was like she was actively avoiding any real conversation with me, dodging questions with quick excuses. And believe me, I tried to brush it off. I wanted to trust her, to believe it was all in my head. Then came the night that really flipped a switch for me. Mia had told me she'd be working late at the gallery again. But around 10 p.m., I happened to walk by our bedroom and noticed her tablet lying on the bed. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to snoop, but this time, I don't know, something just came over me. I picked it up and saw a series of messages lighting up the screen from someone named Jake. I opened the messages and, well, my stomach dropped. There was this string of flirty texts, nothing explicit, but enough to set off alarm bells. Messages about missing each other and not wanting to wait any longer. I felt sick. I could almost feel the ground shifting beneath my feet as I realized my marriage was built on sand, not the solid ground I thought we'd shared. But I wasn't ready to confront her right then. I needed more than just some messages. I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it was. So, I put the tablet back where I found it, trying to act like nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. I started paying even closer attention to every little thing, piecing together moments and patterns that I'd once dismissed. The thing is, I still wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation for it all, that maybe this was just some weird misunderstanding. But I couldn't shake this feeling, a gut-wrenching certainty that things were about to explode. And I was right. After reading those texts, my world felt split in two. There was life before I saw them and whatever was left after. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence in our home, and all I could think was, how did we get here? This wasn't supposed to happen to us, to me. I'd been so sure of her, of us. But now, every late night and every excuse suddenly took on new meaning. Over the next few days, I tried to stay calm, to act normal around her. But I could feel the anger simmering just under the surface, ready to boil over. Mia, though, seemed completely unfazed. She kept up her usual routine, coming and going with that same dismissive attitude. In fact, she'd even started going out more often, claiming it was for work events or casual drinks with friends. I could barely bring myself to look at her, wondering if every time she stepped out the door, she was headed to meet up with this guy, Jake. One evening, I decided to test her. She told me she'd be working late again at the gallery, and I casually offered to bring her dinner. "No, don't bother," she said, a little too quickly. "I'll probably be busy and might not even have time to eat." Her response was so immediate that it felt rehearsed, like she'd anticipated that I might suggest it. I tried not to show how her answer had affected me, just nodding and watching her walk out the door without a second glance back. After she left, I sat there, feeling that all too familiar knot in my stomach. I needed to know, to really know. So, I waited a few minutes, grabbed my keys, and headed out. I knew the gallery's location, knew it was close enough for me to swing by without her noticing. Part of me felt ridiculous, like a paranoid fool following his own wife. But another part, the part that had seen those messages, was desperate for clarity, no matter how painful. When I arrived at the gallery, my heart was pounding. I looked around, expecting to see her car, maybe a light on inside. But the place was dark, completely shut down for the night. That was my answer. She hadn't been here at all. Standing outside that dark gallery, I felt this cold, creeping rage building up. She wasn't where she said she'd be, wasn't working late like she claimed. Instead, she was, well, I didn't know exactly where, but I had a pretty damn good guess. I got back in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The urge to just call her and confront her on the spot was almost overwhelming, but I stopped myself. No, I needed to be smart about this. If she was lying now, she'd just lie again. I needed proof, something solid, undeniable. So I drove back home, trying to think things through. The next few days, I did my best to act normal, though it felt like I was living a double life. On the outside, I was the same old Henry, the doting husband, but on the inside, I was practically a stranger, playing detective, keeping an eye on everything she did. Every time she reached for her phone, every excuse she gave, it just fed my suspicion. Then, one night, I got an idea. If she was sneaking around behind my back, maybe I could catch her in the act, literally. I decided to take a day off work without telling her, making it seem like any other weekday. That way, she wouldn't have her guard up. If she was seeing him, they'd likely use our place, assuming I'd be out of the picture until evening. The next morning, I pretended to get ready for work as usual, grabbing my coffee and heading out the door. But instead of driving to the office, I circled back and parked down the street, close enough to see the house but far enough to stay out of sight. I sat there, waiting, the minutes crawling by as I imagined all the possible ways this could play out. Finally, just before noon, I saw her car pull into the driveway. My pulse quickened, and I leaned forward, eyes glued to the front door. I watched as she got out, and that's when I saw him. A guy I'd never seen before, climbing out of the passenger side. He was tall, with that smug look that makes you want to punch a guy on sight. They didn't even hesitate. They just walked up to the door, her leading the way, him following close behind. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt this strange mix of anger, disgust, and, oddly enough, relief. It was happening, right there in front of me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't crazy. As they walked into the house together, it felt like the world stopped for a second. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it might just give out. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. I'd planned for this moment, prepared myself for it, but nothing could have braced me for the reality of it. After waiting a few minutes, I got out of my car and headed to the front door. My hands were shaking, and I felt this strange, cold calm take over. I was done doubting, done pretending everything was fine. They'd walked into my home, like they had every right to be there, and that was enough for me. I opened the front door quietly, the way I'd seen them do a few minutes earlier. From down the hallway, I could hear faint voices and laughter coming from the living room. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound of her laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in weeks, was like a slap to the face. She hadn't been that happy or carefree with me in God knows how long. As I walked down the hallway, I could see them sitting together on the couch. They were close, too close. She was leaning into him, a little too comfortable, and he had his arm draped casually around her shoulders. They were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice me standing in the doorway. I watched them for a moment, taking it all in. The betrayal, the lies, the audacity of them sitting in my house like they owned the place. Finally, I cleared my throat, and they both froze. Mia turned around, her face going pale when she saw me. She tried to pull away from him, but it was too late for that. The damage was done. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Henry, I thought you were at work." I just stared at her, feeling a kind of anger that I didn't know I was capable of. "Clearly," I replied, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "So, this is what you've been doing while I've been out working? Bringing him here?" She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her eyes were wide, like a deer caught in headlights. Then, without missing a beat, she started with the excuses. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice shaky. He's just a friend, Henry. We were just talking, I swear." I looked at the guy, Jake, who was shifting uncomfortably, clearly not as bold now as he'd seemed before. He started to say something, but I cut him off. "Save it," I said, staring him down. "You can leave now, before I make you." Jake glanced at Mia, as if waiting for her to say something, but she just looked down, silent and defeated. After a tense moment, he muttered something under his breath and made a beeline for the door, leaving Mia and me alone. When the door closed behind him, I turned back to her, waiting. "Well?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Is there anything you'd like to explain?" She tried to speak, stumbling over her words, going on about how she felt lonely and underappreciated, throwing every excuse at me she could think of. But all I could hear were the lies she'd told me, the betrayal she'd so casually brought into our home. I was done listening, done giving her the benefit of the doubt. "I trusted you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we were in this together." And with that, the weight of what she'd done came crashing down on both of us. After Jake left, the house fell into a heavy silence. Mia sat on the couch, staring at the floor, her face flushed, eyes welling up with tears. For a moment, it looked like she might actually feel guilty, but I didn't care. I couldn't muster up any sympathy for her, not after what she'd done. I was numb, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my chest and hollowed me out. I stood there, unable to look at her without feeling sick. "How long has this been going on?" I finally asked, my voice cold and steady. She took a deep breath, still not meeting my gaze. It's been a few months," she whispered. She sounded almost ashamed, but I wasn't interested in her shame. I just wanted the truth, however ugly it was. "Months?" The word echoed in my head, each syllable digging deeper. She'd been lying to me, playing me for a fool, and for months. All those times I'd stayed late at work to give her space, all those little acts of trust, they'd been thrown back in my face. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep control. I wasn't the type to scream or yell, but the anger bubbling inside me was something I'd never felt before. She started going into her reasons, telling me she'd felt neglected, that I was always busy with work, that she felt invisible around me. I tried to listen, but each excuse she offered just made me feel angrier. It was like she was shifting the blame onto me, trying to make me responsible for her betrayal. It was almost laughable. "Oh, so this is my fault?" I shot back, incredulous. "Because I work hard to provide for us, to build a future, you decided to go behind my back? Invite him into our home?" She looked up, startled, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't have an answer. "No, it's not your fault," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up. I don't know. Henry, I feel like I lost myself somewhere along the way." Lost yourself? I echoed, shaking my head. And you thought the solution was to have an affair? To bring him here, right under my nose? She started crying, real, ugly tears, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I was too consumed by the betrayal, too hurt by how little respect she'd shown for me, for our marriage. Watching her break down didn't bring any satisfaction. It just reminded me of how far we'd fallen, how irreparably broken things were. I sat down, feeling the weight of it all settle on me. I loved you, Mia, I said quietly, not sure if she even heard me. I thought you were my partner, my everything. For the first time, she looked up, truly looked at me, and I saw the guilt and regret in her eyes. But it was too late for that. Whatever we'd had was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be put back together. As I sat there, staring at her, I realized I was mourning something that had been dead for a long time, something I hadn't even noticed slipping away. And that thought hit me harder than anything else. After our confrontation, the house felt emptier than ever. Mia stayed in the guest room that night, and I could hear her crying, but I didn't go to her. I didn't have it in me to comfort her, to pretend like we were going to be okay. Instead, I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the storm of emotions tearing me apart. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all swirled together, making it impossible to think straight. I kept replaying everything over in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. I thought about the night we met, the promises we'd made, the future we'd planned together. It all felt so meaningless now, like it had been some kind of illusion, a version of reality that only I had been seeing. The next morning, Mia tried to talk to me, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. I was too exhausted, too drained from the constant cycle of anger and heartbreak. She asked if we could sit down and talk things through, but I just shook my head, telling her I needed time to process everything. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to feel bad about it. She'd broken something inside me, something I didn't think could ever be fixed. Over the next few days, we barely spoke. Mia tried. I'll give her that, but every time I looked at her, all I could think about was Jake in our home. The lies she told me, the months of betrayal. I felt trapped in this nightmare, unable to escape or find any sense of peace. At one point, I considered going to a therapist, hoping it might help me sort through my feelings, but I couldn't bring myself to go. It felt too raw, too personal to share with anyone. So, I kept it all bottled up, letting it simmer inside me, unsure of where it would all lead. Eventually, I started confiding in a friend, someone who'd known me and Mia since we first got together. I told him everything, from the texts on her tablet to catching her in the house with Jake. He listened quietly, not judging or interrupting, just letting me vent. When I finished, he looked at me with this mix of sympathy and anger on my behalf. "She doesn't deserve you, Henry," he said. "You gave her everything, and she threw it away. You don't owe her anything." Hearing that gave me a strange kind of validation, a sense that maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling the way I did. But it didn't make the pain go away. It didn't erase the memories, the what-ifs, the lingering hope that somehow, someway, things might go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. I knew I'd never look at her the same way again. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between Mia and me grew thicker, heavier, like a weight pressing down on both of us. We moved around each other like strangers, exchanging only the bare minimum of words, neither of us willing to address the elephant in the room. She still tried every now and then, coming up with new ways to apologize, new reasons for why she did what she did, but I'd lost the patience to listen. One evening, I came home from work to find her sitting at the dining table, waiting for me. She had this look in her eyes, a mixture of sadness and determination. I could tell she'd been thinking about what to say, probably rehearsing it over and over in her head. Part of me didn't even want to hear it, but I figured it was time to at least let her speak her piece. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to fix," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Henry. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just give me a chance to make it right." I looked at her, studying her face, searching for any hint of the woman I'd once loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything. But all I could see were the lies, the betrayal, the months of sneaking around. The fact that she'd brought her lover into our home, that she'd desecrated the one place that was supposed to be ours, it was something I couldn't shake. It was burned into my mind, a scar that wouldn't fade. I don't know if there's anything left to fix, Mia, I said finally, my voice empty, hollow. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice, over and over again, and I don't think I can look past that. She started crying again, pleading with me to give her another chance, promising that she'd never see Jake again, that she'd do whatever it took to regain my trust. But I could feel myself shutting down, building walls around the hurt just to survive. I'd given her everything, and in return, she'd torn our life apart. Maybe you're sorry now, I said, but where was that remorse when you were meeting him? Where was that guilt when you lied to my face? I stood up, unable to sit there any longer, needing to put distance between us before I said something I'd regret. I think it's best if we spend some time apart, figure out what we both really want. Her face crumpled, and she looked up at me, her eyes desperate. Henry, please, don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. I'm not the one who threw it away, Mia. You did. With that, I grabbed a few things and left, not sure where I was going, but certain that I needed to be anywhere but there. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak, knowing that I'd finally taken the first step toward healing, even if that meant leaving the woman I'd once thought was my forever. Leaving that night felt like stepping off a cliff. I had no idea what life looked like without Mia in it, without the routines we built together. But after I walked out, a weight lifted, like I could finally breathe again. I rented a small place across town, a simple apartment that barely had any furniture. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A space where I didn't have to feel her absence in every corner. At first, the loneliness was intense. I'd come home from work, and the silence would hit me, reminding me of everything I'd lost. I'd look around, half expecting her to walk through the door, half hoping she wouldn't. It was a strange place to be, caught between grief and relief. Friends and family reached out, offering their support, and while I appreciated it, there was a part of this that I had to go through alone. One night, a couple of weeks after I'd left, I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone, pictures from trips we'd taken, dinners with friends, those little snapshots of a life that felt like someone else's now. Looking at those photos, I realized that I'd been holding onto this idea of our relationship, this fantasy that everything had been perfect. But the truth was, somewhere along the line, we'd both stopped trying. Maybe her betrayal was the final blow, but we'd been drifting apart long before that. I decided then that I needed to find a way to move forward, to focus on myself, and figure out who I was outside of this relationship. So, I threw myself into my work, taking on projects that I'd put off, and even signed up for a photography class I'd been eyeing for years. I started going on hikes again, taking my camera with me, rediscovering that part of myself that I'd set aside. With time, I could feel myself healing. The anger started to fade, replaced by a strange kind of acceptance. I'd loved Mia, truly and deeply, but I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't undo the choices she'd made, or the pain that came with them. All I could do was pick up the pieces and figure out what came next. Months went by, and one day, I got a message from Mia. She wanted to meet up, to talk. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face her, but eventually agreed. We met at a quiet cafe, a place far from where we'd ever gone together. Seeing her again brought a mix of emotions, but I could tell she'd changed too. She seemed remorseful, genuinely regretful, but the wound was still too deep for me to consider anything more than a conversation. We talked, clearing the air, each of us owning up to our part in the breakdown of our marriage. She apologized sincerely, and for the first time, I believed her. It wasn't enough to make me want to go back, but it was enough for me to let go of the resentment I'd been carrying. When we said goodbye, I felt a kind of closure that I hadn't thought possible. I didn't hate her. I didn't pity her. I just accepted it. And as I walked away, I knew I was finally ready to move forward, to embrace whatever the future held without looking back. Months turned into a year, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I poured myself into work, advancing in ways I hadn't even dreamed of before. The photography hobby became more than just an outlet. It turned into a second career. I started doing exhibitions of my own, capturing moments of urban life that resonated with the isolation and resilience I'd been feeling. It was strange, almost poetic, how those pictures became a visual record of my healing process. Looking back, I could see things more clearly. The pain had dulled, replaced by a sense of clarity and, oddly enough, gratitude. That whole experience had taught me some hard lessons, ones I hadn't wanted to learn but now valued more than anything. I'd learned not to ignore those small signals in a relationship, the quiet distances and missed moments. I'd learned the importance of speaking up, of not letting resentment build in the shadows. And most importantly, I'd learned to value myself, to never settle for a relationship where I wasn't respected. Sometimes people ask me if I'd ever take Mia back, or if I've forgiven her. And well, the truth is, I did forgive her in a way, but I knew I'd never go back. I'd let go of the anger and the bitterness because holding on to that only weighed me down. But I'd also let go of the idea of us, the fantasy I'd clung to for too long. I started dating again eventually, cautiously at first, taking it slow. Each relationship felt different now, more intentional, more real. I wasn't looking for someone to fill the space Mia had left. I was looking for someone to build something new with, something grounded in trust and honesty. I'd learned from my past, and I was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. If I could give advice to anyone in a similar situation, it would be this: trust your instincts, respect yourself, and know when to let go. It's painful, no doubt about it, but sometimes, walking away is the first step toward finding yourself again. Life moves on, even when it feels like it won't. And as hard as it is to believe in the moment, the pain does fade, and a new beginning is always waiting just around the corner. Now, as I stand on this side of things, I feel stronger, more sure of who I am and what I want. And if nothing else, I can say this: I've made peace with the past, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.